And it's good to see everyone today, whether it's a virtual background that's behind you or a real background. It's nice to see everyone. Hopefully everybody is safe and healthy as COVID restrictions pick up again and make our lives that much more difficult again. But we're all here together, and it's good. It's good to be together. So our portion this morning is this week is Toldot, and in the Eitz Chaim, it's on page 146. In whatever edition of the Chumash you have, it's Genesis chapter 25, beginning with verse 19, 25:19. Toldot, and let me say the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, as we do, the past couple of weeks, I want to be sure that we understand the context of this week's Torah portion. It begins, well, first, it should be interesting that it's starting in the middle of a chapter. So chapter 25, verse 19, we would imagine that a Torah portion should start at the beginning of a chapter, not in the middle of a chapter. So this says something to us that the chapter breaks and the verses were put in after the rabbis defined the portions. So chapters and verses were designated by the church fathers about, 1,500 years ago, something like that, or maybe even closer, later than that. But the portions were divided up by the rabbis themselves 2,000 years ago, if not before. Certainly the Torah as we know it, we know it, the earliest copy that we have is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're about 2,000 years old or so. The tradition, of course, is that Torah scrolls go back to Mount Sinai. Kind of if you picture the movie The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, Charlton Heston is coming down Mount Sinai with a leather briefcase with a scroll of each book of Torah in his leather briefcase. So did it happen like that? Who knows? We imagine that the Torah, because of how the Torah is written today, that it's one long scroll as opposed to 5 separate scrolls, one for each book of the Torah. But it's unclear exactly how Torah scrolls were made and were held in the ark. Certainly would make it easier for the person lifting the Torah to know that they would be lifting only one scroll of 5 as opposed to the long 5 scrolls. But be that as it may, the division of the Torah by the rabbis is into portions and not into chapters and verses. The people, when Jews study Torah today, a traditional Jew would be referring to a reference in the Torah by the portion that it's in, but there are others who will also refer to chapter and verse. So that, for example, when you study Talmud with the traditional text of the Talmud, that is in the Hebrew, the Aramaic Hebrew text, there are footnotes there in the text that will refer to what verse the Talmud is referring to, and that footnote has it as chapter and verse as opposed to portion. So they can go either way. The other thing that the fact that our portion begins with verse 19 is further elaborating the idea that we need to look back to last week's portion, the end of it, to see what the context is. So our portion begins, Ve'ele Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holid et Yitzchak. Translating it literally, this is the history or the story of Isaac, son of Abraham, comma, Abraham gave birth to Isaac. Okay, now the context is, if you turn back to page 141 in the Eitz Chaim, or chapter 25, verse 12, we can understand why our portion begins Ve'ele Toldot, because verse 12 has Ve'ele Toldot Yishmael ben Avraham, Asher Yalda Hagar Hamitzrit Shivchat Sarah leAvraham. And this is the story, or so very interesting. It's the exact same word. Page 141, verse 12 says, this is the line of Ishmael. On page 146, this is the story of Isaac. It's the exact same word, spelled a little bit differently, only because the vavs in the word Toldot on page 141 are missing. That sometimes happens when Hebrew is written in the Torah. Sometimes some vowels are missing, but that's okay. It's the vowels were put in later by the rabbis about 1200, 1300 years ago. Ve'ele Toldot Ishmael. This is the story of Ishmael, son of Abraham, who Hagar the Egyptian, the maid servant of Sarah, gave birth to Abraham. So as opposed to, this is the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham gave birth to Isaac, or Abraham begot Isaac, to make more sense, obviously, because Abraham didn't give birth to him. So it's just interesting what the Torah chooses to include in defining who these people are. So we to add all the extra conditions to Yishmael, son of Abraham. But wait, we got a parenthetical note here. He's the son by Hagar the Egyptian, the maid of Sarah. As opposed to our portion, 146, Abraham begot Isaac. No need to have any parenthetical notes. So clear from the Torah, Isaac's the guy. He's the heir to Abraham. And even though Ishmael is Abraham's son, he's second to Isaac. Okay, and then it goes on to verse 13 on page 141 to the end of the portion is just who Ishmael married and the names of his children. Okay, so that sets that part up for one line of Abraham's descendants, and we're done with them. The focus of the Torah now is on the other line of Abraham, which is our line. So it's the Jewish line of Abraham is Abraham, Isaac, and then this portion will determine whether it will be Jacob or Esau next. Okay, so this whole story, why it's chosen this way, and certainly in the Quran, the Muslim Bible, the Abraham-Ishmael line is the more important one. The Isaac line, he's mentioned in the Quran, but Ishmael's number one in the Quran, Isaac's number one in the Torah. So the rabbis so there's not much that we have to look at the Torah to understand the focus, but there's more to, especially in this portion, that the rabbis are going to add to highlight their perspective on the people in the portion themselves and why they are the raised up important figures that they are. They might not come across that way in the portions, this one and following ones, but the rabbis will work hard to create midrash, commentary, and interpretation that will gloss over some of the superficial details that we read in the story and provide the real story or the rabbinic story that we are supposed to maintain. So let's read through at least the beginning of this week's portion to get some examples of how the rabbis are going to create the story beneath the story to highlight Jacob and demean and degrade Esau. So, Ve'ela Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holided Yitzchak. So we read that already. This is the line of, or the story of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham gave birth or begat Isaac. Vayehi Yitzchak ben Arba'im Shana. Isaac was 40 years old. Bekachto et Rivka, when he took Rebekah, which means in biblical Hebrew, he married Rebekah. Bat Betuel ha'arami, the daughter of Betuel the Aramean, mi Padan Aram, from the town or the village of Padan Aram. Achot Lavan, she's the sister of Lavan ha'arami, the sister of Lavan the Aramean. Lo leisha, took Rebekah to him as a wife. Okay, so we have the extra details highlighting who Rebekah is, and we need to know the Torah adds who her brother is, not only because her brother was an important figure in the story that we read in Chaye Sarah last week in setting up the negotiation with Abraham's servant Eliezer to agree to send Rebekah to marry Isaac, but also, of course, we're going to meet Lavan in next week's portion when Jacob flees home at the end of this week's portion and heads back to Rebekah's home, and he'll be meeting his uncle Lavan there. So because Lavan is central to last week's portion and next week's portion, Rebekah is identified by who her brother is right here. Okay, verse 21, Vayetar Yitzchak la'Adonai, and Isaac prayed to God. Now this word for praying is an unusual word. It's not used in modern Hebrew, and it's not used in rabbinic Hebrew, really. We know of the word Vayit Palel, and he prayed, and tefillah means prayer. Vayetar is kind of a biblical word for that. Vayetar Yitzchak la'Adonai, and here it's pleaded and not prayed, but it's Isaac pleaded in a prayer form. You know, if you're pleading to God, then by definition, that's a prayer. As opposed to pleading with somebody else, that's not a prayer. That form of, if you go to a king and make a plea to a king or a queen, or to the prime minister, or to the president, that plea may not have any prayer of being listened to, but it's not a prayer because it's a human being to whom you are asking to intercede on your behalf. When you're asking God to intercede on your behalf, then that plea becomes a prayer, which is, and pleading is a form of prayer, just as a regular form of talking could be prayer with God, or you could be thanking God, or you could be praising God. Those are all forms of prayer in the liturgy, in the prayer book that we have, and in spontaneous prayers that we have. So when you plead with God, that plea is by definition a prayer. So Isaac pleaded with God, lenochach ishto. So in the English, it says on behalf of his wife. It could also mean in the presence of his wife. So, so then that raises a question, how is this prayer happening? What are the logistics here? Is Isaac going somewhere in order to pray to God? It doesn't say. It doesn't say where he went to do this. We know from previous portions that when sometimes Abraham set up an altar and prayed, or sometimes he just had to walk outside his tent. And the Torah says that Abraham left his tent, looked up in the sky, and heard God's voice tell him, look up in the sky, count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. Or he walked outside and God appeared and told him to take these animals and slaughter them, lay them out on the ground, and God appeared in this vision of fire. Or Abraham walked outside and God appeared and they had the discussion about Sodom and Gomorrah. Or go to the Mount Moriah. And so here Isaac, we don't know where Isaac is in this prayer. So is he in the tent? Is he by himself? Are he and Rebekah together, but Isaac is doing the talking? We don't know exactly, so that leaves much to our imagination as to how we could picture this pleading, this prayer taking place. And it's interesting that it is ambiguous here because, like I said, in other places earlier in the Torah, we're told exactly where, or we're given some kind of description of where Abraham went when he had a vision of God or God appeared to him. Here, and also in last week's portion, Isaac is out in the field meditating. But here we don't know where he is. Okay, so Isaac pleaded with God in the presence of his wife, on behalf of his wife, because she is barren. So again, this is the second story in the Torah of a barren woman, second of many in the entire Bible of barren women, and how God and people intercede on the barren woman's behalf. So plenty of stories, and Bible doctorates have been written just about the image or the motif of the barren woman in the Bible. So he prays to her because she is barren. Vaye'etar lo Adonai, and God answered him. So the same word for Isaac pleading with God, the same verb, vaye'etar, is the same word of God answering the prayer. So that's interesting. That you can have the same word for the communication from human to God as for the communication of God to human. So God answers, or it has to be answer. You can't say God prays back or pleads back. God answers back, and what is the form of the answer? Vatahar Rivka ishto. Rivka, his wife, conceived. So somehow God answers Isaac's prayer by curing Rebekah's barrenness just this one time, because she'll give birth to twins, of course. I'm not giving anything away, but she doesn't have any other children after that. Just like Sarah gives birth only once to Isaac. So the barrenness, it's not as if now she's going to have lots of children for many years. It's just this one-time deal. So let's go on. So this pregnancy then is not an easy pregnancy. So verse 22, page 147. Hi, Elizabeth. We're in the portion Toldot, chapter 25, verse 22. And if you have the Eitz Chaim, it's the top of page 147. Vayitrotsatsu habanim bekirba, vatomer. So here, verse 21. She conceives, and verse 22 assumes that we know already that she has twins. Vayitrotzetsu habanim bekirba, and they're boys. So, way before ultrasound, she knew, or the narrator knows, that they are boys. So the boys are vayitrotzetsu. So it comes from the root la roots, to run. So it's just a different form of the verb. So are they running? Well, they are running inside of her. So, obviously, women who have been pregnant feel the baby kicking, and that's normal. And tragically, it's that something could be wrong if the baby had been kicking regularly and then stops kicking. That's You get to the doctor if that happens. But if it's kicking all the time, usually there's a break and there's some respite from that. This might imply that this kicking is happening all the time. So the boys are running, kicking bikir ba inside of her. Vatomer im kain lama ze anochi. So she said, now, who is she talking to? She says to herself, she says this out loud, Lama ze anochi, why am I alive? Or why is this happening to me? Or why am I enduring this? Lama ze anochi, why? To literally translate, it would mean, why am I this? That's what that means. Why am I this? Which is ambiguous, which in this context would mean, why is this happening to me? Hi, Rita. We're in Toldot, and if you have the Eitz Chaim, it's page 147. If you have any other Chumash, it's verse 22 at the beginning of the portion, chapter 25, verse 22. So she says, Lama ze anochi, why is this happening to me? So it's not normal kind of running, kicking inside of her. And because it is constant, it's unbearable. So it's one thing if it's one baby doing this. She has twins. Well, we know later that she has twins. We only know here they're boys. It could be more than two. It could be triplets. It could be quadruplets for all we know. It's just the plural, the boys, or to be egalitarian, our English translation says the children struggled in her womb. But we know they are boys, so it's okay to translate the boys. So she says, as she's saying to herself, how do we know she's saying this? That's a question too, who the narrator is, who's telling us that she says this. But then she says, Vatelech lidrosh et Adonai. Now, Isaac vayetar la Adonai, that's verse 21. So his form of talking with God is vayetar. Her form of talking to God is lidrosh et Adonai. So the English says she went to inquire of the Lord. We could also translate lidrosh as to search for, or to study, because the word midrash, interpretation, commentary, comes from this root, daled resh shin. So midrash, the work of the product of studying is midrash. The house of study is a beit midrash. So lidrosh is to search. So inquire is another word for searching, but the searching is a religious quest. So in other words, if you're doing research for a term paper, you wouldn't say you're doing midrash. You would say you're doing mechkar. That's research, more scientific kind of. So whether you're doing a scientific experiment or you're doing a history term paper, that's called mechkar. Midrash, I would say, is limited solely to Jewish text research, or limited to our encounter with God. Okay, so it's a spiritual kind of quest. So that's how we would do that. Vatelech lidrosh et Adonai. She went to on this spiritual quest of God. So as I always say, feel free to unmute yourself or to type in a question in chat. So how did Rebecca know to do this? What kind of how would she know? Who is she learning how to search for God from? Because we know she's from Aram, she's an Aramean, and we know later in next week's portion, Rachel and Leah have teraphim, these little idols. And so did Rebecca learn how to search for God from Isaac? When Isaac is out meditating in the field, he's lasuach basadeh, and so that meditating in the field, we understand as the reader, he's meditating with God, and the rabbis understand that he's davening mincha, because his meditation in the field towards evening is the example for the rabbis that he must have been davening mincha. So where is Rebecca learning how to do this? That's a question that we rightfully ask here. What's Rebecca's model? And again, what she is doing is a different verb. She didn't go le'ater et Adonai. She went lidrosh et Adonai. And Isaac in verse 21, vayetar Yitzchak la'Adonai. Okay, so Isaac's method of communicating with God is the verb vayetar. Rebecca's method of communicating with God is lidrosh. And you can't just say that it's the author of the Torah just wanting to use a different verb, meaning the same thing. You really can't say that. It's a different word here meant to have us raise the question, what does this mean? I don't have an answer. I'm just saying that by carefully reading the text, these questions should arise and can provides a certain picture of who Isaac and Rebecca are, right? How long has she been barren for? He was 40 when they were married. How old are they now when she's barren and he's praying for her and she's pregnant and praying about the boys running inside of her? How much time has elapsed? We don't know the answer to that question either. Okay, so all these questions remain cryptic because they're not important enough for the Torah to answer. What's important is the fact that she is pregnant as a gift from God, and she has boys inside of her. Okay, so we go on. Vayomer Adonai la. So her lidrosh et Adonai, her inquiring, her searching for God, was successful because God answers. God talks to her. So however she was searching and figuring out how to talk to God, it was a success because God answers. Shnei goyim bevitnech. 2 nations are in your belly. Okay, so now there is a word for womb in Hebrew, and the fact that our English is translating the word beten as womb is technically wrong. There are 2 nations in your belly. Beten is stomach or belly, like Jonah was swallowed and was in the belly of the fish. That's the beten. The womb is rechem, and the word mercy, rachamim, comes from rechem. So that's interesting, right? Just as the word hysterical is hysterectomy, is from the Greek or Latin for womb. Go figure. So what the Romans or the Greeks are telling you about the womb, and what other word you can use that for, where what Hebrew language is telling us about the womb, and what that you can use that same word for, rechem, womb, rachamim, mercy. So just fascinating about the development of language. So God says to her, there are two nations in your, and you can tell by how the Hebrew is arranged here in our Chumash. It's not arranged differently in the Torah scroll itself, but in the Chumash, the fact that it's shorter lines tells you that this is a poem. So God answers in a prayerful, poetic kind of way. There are two nations in your belly, Ushnei leumim mimeayich yiparedu, and two nations. So leum is a nation, goy is a nation. Shnei leumim mimeayich, from your loins will depart. So me'ayim are really your loins, and here it's just translated as your body. Your me'ayim, or for your intestines, it's from your insides. So again, so it's not using womb, it's using belly and intestines or insides. Two nations from your insides will depart. Yiparedu will depart, or here it says will issue. Ulaom milaom ye'ematz. One nation will be stronger from the other nation. So, or you could translate, one nation will be stronger than the other nation. Either way, you can translate that, ulaom milaom ye'ematz. So one nation from another nation will be courageous or mighty or get strong. V'rav ya'avod sa'ir. And here, usually Rav is, could be master, could be in rabbinic Hebrew, a Rav is a rabbi, but a Rav could be master, or the, here it says the older one will be subservient to, or just will serve the younger. Sa'ir is younger. So the older will serve the younger. Okay, so God's answering, you're worried about you yourself, Rebecca, personally. I'm answering you, or that the Torah has God answering Rebecca, saying, there's bigger things at stake happening inside of you. And you are worried about the short term, just you yourself individually, but really what's going on is a matter of eternity. And so you got to essentially bear with this. And this is what the future is going to hold for you as well, with these boys who are inside of you. They're not going to get along. One's going to be mightier than the other one, and the other one's going to serve the other one. So it's not good. But at least this lays the groundwork for what's going on, because you could argue that Rebecca will do everything she can to ensure that this prayer, the answer that she got from God, be fulfilled. And then you could argue, well, even though you may be upset with what Rebecca does, forces Jacob, like we all know the story, and the Torah knows that we know the story already. The fact that Rebecca has Jacob dress up as Esau, you could see is all deceit, and that's terrible behavior for one mother, having one son cause distress to the other son. Well, you could argue she's only fulfilling the words of this prophecy that God is giving her. So we go on.
Rabbi?
Yes, wait, first Saul, did you have a question?
I did.
Yeah, go ahead.
In verse 23, Goyim is spelled twice, and does it appear, why is that? And,
okay, yeah.
and
So
does it appear in the Torah like that?
no, okay. So what what that means is, so what Saul is referring to is in the fourth line of the Eitz Chaim, and it's only in our edition of the Eitz Chaim that you see it this way. This is how the Eitz Chaim chooses to point out the difference between how the word is printed in the text itself, in the Torah. So in the Torah, it's spelled Gimel Yud Yud Mem, no vowels. That's how it looks in the Torah. But we're supposed to read it as Goyim, Gimel Vav Yud Mem, with the vowels. That's how the Eitz Chaim points out. When you see a word in smaller font next to the word as it should, as it in the font size with the cantillation marks and the vowels as they normally appear, then the smaller word means that's what this word looks like in the Torah scroll. And you might then, if you see that word, Gimel Yud Yud Mem, you might read that as Gaim or Geim, but since there's no O sound there would be a letter Vav. If you're writing Hebrew without the points and the lines for the vowels, you insert a Yud sometimes to get the E sound, and you would insert the Vav for the O sound. Okay, so since there's no Vav here in the Torah scroll itself, then either there's a mistake, that it's possible that the first Yud was written as a Yud instead of a Vav. Anyway, whatever it is, it's just that it's under the rabbis clearly, when they put the vowels in the text 1,300 years ago, the accepted tradition was that that word Gimel Yud Yud Mem should be pronounced Goyim. And so in printed editions of a Chumash, they make the notation, this is how Eitz Chaim does it. The Hertz Chumash does it a different way. Other Chumashim do it different ways. This is the accepted way of how to pronounce and sing that word, Gimel Yud Yud Mem. Okay? Elizabeth, what were you going to ask?
I was going to ask you about Rebecca inquiring of the Lord, and that's the same root as Midrash,
right,
as you said, but the Lord actually speaks to her.
Yes.
And it's like a prophetic
yes
thing. So does that mean Rebecca is also a prophetess, or like
well,
what's the meaning of that exactly?
Right. So all it means is that Rebecca, as well as Sarah and Rachel and Leah, are all considered on the same level as matriarchs, same level as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had extended conversations over their lifetimes with God. Even though Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah had incidental encounters with God, it's enough to put them on the same spiritual level as their husbands.
Okay.
And so that's what that means. But the answer, it is interesting here, when Isaac pleads with God to cure her barrenness, God answers that prayer not by talking to Isaac saying, "I heard you, and she's going to be pregnant." Unlike the angels who speak to Abraham and Sarah and tell them that in a year's time they're going to have a baby, this doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way right here. The answer to Isaac knows that his plea has been answered because Rebecca gets pregnant. And so that's an interesting thing too. So when couples are suffering from infertility, obviously there are medical things to do to possibly solve that. They're expensive, but there are medical solutions to infertility today. And we would be tempted, any couple who has their infertility solved that way would be thankful for the doctors and nurses and medical science. So it's less seen as a miracle that the infertility has been solved. And what the Torah is pointing out here is we don't know how old Rebecca and Isaac are here. Are they still of childbearing age? We don't know. So then how, but she's barren. How long do you have to be barren to be considered barren? Right? So in other words, how many months of trying to get pregnant does that trying to get pregnant become clear that she is barren? So we don't know. We do know, just from trying to figure out the ages of Abraham and Sarah at the time, that she was, the fact, I think it's from Abraham and Sarah that we learn Sarah was barren for, no, it can't be from that. One of the patriarchs and matriarch couples, she was barren for 10 years before God answered and solved her fertility. And from that, the rabbis learn that if a couple are infertile for 10 years, then that would be grounds for divorce. That a husband can request divorce from the wife if they are childless for 10 years. So that for the rabbis. So again, not in modern time necessarily, but for in the time of the rabbis. So again,
Rabbi,
just one second, Rita, but just to finish this thought, the idea that Rebecca got pregnant, the point for the Torah is that Isaac saw that as God answering his prayer, as opposed to understanding it as it naturally happened. So I think there's a lesson here that things that naturally happen in our lives are being taught to us from the Torah as that we should learn them as gifts from God. Okay, so that's another aspect here. Rita, yes, I saw your hand.
and you just said, yes, you just said that we didn't know Isaac's age, but it's in the sentence, and Isaac was 70 old when she bore them.
Well, that's coming up. That's
Oh,
yes.
okay, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so yes,
I'm
right,
going back.
right.
Okay.
So that right.
One more comment on the.
Yeah, there it goes. It's in verse 26 that we know that
Right.
that he is 60, but we don't know how old she is. We're not told that.
Oh, okay.
Right? So
And
we're told that he's 40 when they got married, and we're told that he's 60 when she gives birth. So okay, so maybe they were. So obviously they were married for 20 years before Jacob and Esau and Jacob were born. Yes.
and to
Okay.
get back to
Yes.
Lidrosh, we also can refer to somebody giving a good drash. He gave a drash.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Right?
Yeah, that's more Yiddish on that, right? So like in Hebrew,
Yes.
it could be a drasha. In
Right.
Yiddish, it would be a drasha or a drosh.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So a drasha is more like a sermon, which is interpreting words of Torah in order to teach a religious message. Yes, so that's a drasha, another word that comes from Daled Resh Shem. Yes. Okay, so let's read on a little bit more. And so Vayimleu Yameha Laledet, verse 24. So her pregnancy came to term. That's essentially what those three words mean. Vehine Tomim Bevitna, and behold, there were twins in her belly. Now here, so just to highlight again Saul's point, that here there's an asterisk after the word Tomim. And that asterisk leads you to below the Hebrew there, right above the English commentary. It says there in italics, V24. And then in Hebrew, without vowels, it says chaser, aleph, apostrophe, yud, apostrophe. So the word that's telling us that the letters aleph and yud are missing, chaser, missing, from this word that is spelled out here as tomim, taf, vav, mem, mem, sofit, final mem. So in other words, the word twins in Hebrew is te'omim. So what's missing is the aleph between the tuf and the vav, and the yud between the two mems. So normally the word would be te'omim, and here the Eitz Chaim decided not to do it the way they did it in verse 23, and just leave it this way as tomim, and just have a footnote to tell us that an aleph and a yud are missing. So there are two ways of how the Eitz Chaim tells us that there's a discrepancy in the word and how it should be spelled out and how it is printed in the Torah scroll itself. Okay, so vehine tomim bevitna, and behold, there were twins in her belly. Vayetze harishon admoni, the first one came out very red. Kulo ke'aderet se'ar, all of him in a hairy mantle. So all covered in hair. Vayikru shemo Esav, and they called him Esau. Va'acharechein, and afterwards, we don't know how far afterwards, Yatsa Achiv, his brother came out. V'yado ochezet ba'akev Esav, and his hand was holding on to the heel of Esav. Now, I don't know if that can really happen when twins are born. Usually there's a few minutes, if not more than a few minutes, between the birth of twins, whether they're identical or fraternal. So I don't know if it ever happened if it could ever happen. I guess I'd have to ask an OBGYN from their personal experience. When twins are born, can one be holding on to the other one? I guess it's possible, but I don't know. So so he was holding on to the heel of Esav, Vayikra Shmo Yaakov, and they called his name Jacob. So you see in his name, the word Akev, meaning heel, Ayin Kuf Bet, becomes part of his name, Yaakov, Yud Ayin Kuf Bet, right? So the Yitzchak ben Shishim Shana Beledet Otam, and Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. Okay, so it's interesting. We don't know how old Rebecca is. We're told about Sarah's age a couple of times in previous portions. Why the Torah didn't want to tell us about Rebecca's age, it's unclear. So let's go on a little bit more. Vayigdalu hane'arim, the boys, the youths, grew up. Vayehi Esav ish yodei tzayid, and Esau became a man who knows how to hunt. Ish sadeh, a man of the field. V'Yaakov ish tam. So and Jacob became a. Now, how do we translate the word tam? Now, is this related to Tamim, like Noah was a righteous man in his ish tam? How were we introduced to Noah at the beginning of that portion? Just one second. Ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. So is it, how do we understand Tom here? It's translated as a mild man. Is he a blameless man? Is he an innocent man? Is he a simple man? Right? Because one of the sons of the four sons of the Passover Seder is Tom. That's translated as simple, meaning, not all there intellectually. So it's unclear, it's ambiguous how to translate that. Are we supposed to be reminded of Noah, Ish Tamim, or is this a separate kind of idea about Tom? So Yaakov is a simple man, simple not necessarily meaning intellectually simple, just doesn't need a lot, that kind of simple kind of man. Yoshev Ohalim, sits in the tents. I guess you could translate that as a homebody. Okay, because homes, they had tents, and these were shepherds, their family. So, we know about Abraham and Sarah's tent. So clearly their home was a tent. So Isaac, Esau was a hunter. Jacob was a simple man staying at home. Vayehav Yitzchak et Esav kitzayid befiv. And Isaac loved Esau because the hunt was in his mouth. The Rivka ohevet et Yaakov. And Rivka loved Jacob for no reason. Isaac loves Esau for the reason that there's hunt in his mouth. Rebecca loves Jacob for no reason at all. So there is one comment below the line on verse 28 on page 147. Isaac favored Esau. Perhaps he raised Esau to do many of the things he had never been able to do when he was growing up, asking Esau to fill in the blank spaces in his own life. And he, on 148 below the line, loved his physically gifted son for being what he had never been. So that's psychologically kind of adding to this, obviously a child of old age that Isaac was. Maybe he was coddled, spoiled, overprotected by his parents, making sure that nothing happened to him and he wouldn't get involved in too many things to potentially get injured or anything like that. So now, as a married man and having twins, he's allowing his son to do the things that he was never allowed to do. It's a logical, perfectly reasonable way to understand the idea of why Isaac would be loving Esau. It's just clearly from the text itself, Isaac has a reason to love Esau. Rebecca has no reason to love Jacob. And that's what we would imagine that parents to love their children without reason. But Isaac loves Esau for a reason, that he was a hunter. Yes, Barbara, you want to ask a question? You have to unmute yourself.
But that at the same time, it makes Rebecca want to love her other son, who may not feel loved at all. And
okay.
then the tense would make him also a mama's boy. He stayed in the tents.
Right. So yes. So you would imagine that he'd be a mama's boy, right? And that's there's nothing sexist about that. It's just the way society was in the time of the Bible. Women stayed back and taking care of the home while the husband was out in the fields or whatever he was doing. It's interesting also the verb tense, T-E-N-S-E, of loving. So Vayehav Yitzchak would be the past tense. Isaac loved Esau, but it says here, Rivka ohevet, that's the present tense. Rivka loves Jacob. That's how it technically should be translated. The English puts it both in the past tense as both favored. Isaac favored, Rebecca favored, but really Isaac loved Esau, Rebecca loves Jacob. Why the Hebrew changes the tense there, I'm not sure. There's one thing before our time runs away from us, so that to highlight Midrash about the boys running inside of Rebecca, and to how the rabbis kind of foreshadow the future with Jacob and Esau. That they say, what would they be running about? Why were they running all the time? So the rabbis answer in this famous Midrash, it's in Rashi, but it's in Midrash from before Rashi, saying that whenever Rebecca would walk by, and this is just typical Midrash, they assume that what exists in the rabbi's time must have existed in biblical time. So just as there were houses of study in the rabbi's time, there must have been houses of study in the time of Abraham and Sarah and even before, even though clearly there's nothing to study because you're studying Torah in the house of study in the time of the rabbis, but there's no Torah yet in the time of Abraham, Sarah. But the rabbis first say, no, no, no. Of course, the Torah pre-existed the creation of the universe. And so therefore, these wise people in the Torah knew the Torah and they were taught it on their own. And Noah's son Shem and his grandson Aver founded the first yeshiva in Canaan, the land of Israel. And so the yeshiva was there, and that's where Abraham went to study, a purely fanciful creation of the rabbis that Noah's son Shem and his grandson Aver would have set up this yeshiva in the land of Israel. Okay, so when Rebecca ever walked by her family's yeshiva, Jacob would be kicking, wanting to get out to study. And whenever she walked by a place of idol worship, Esau would be the one kicking, wanting to get out to worship idols. So of course, that never was and never could be. Well, there could have been places of idol worship, but there was never a house of study at the time of Isaac and Rebekah. But the rabbis were putting that back into the story to say, even in the womb, Esau is an idolater and Jacob is a righteous Jewish man. And they deserved the fate that would come later in this portion and to all of history, right? Because Esau becomes the ancestor of, well, because he's called an Admoni, a red person, the nation of Edom is descended from Esau, that we know later in the Torah, and also the Roman Empire is connected to Esau. So Israel's arch enemy 2,000 years ago that destroyed the temple in Jerusalem is related to Esau. And the rabbis do that, attach figures to empires, nations that exist in their time, and to teach a little bit about how Jacob treated Esau is foreshadowing of how, as a result, Esau is going to be treating Jacob, or the Roman Empire would be treating Israel later in history. So again, lots of things here that from the cryptic way in which the Torah tells the story, we raise some psychological questions and spiritual questions. The nature of Isaac's prayer, the nature of recognizing the answer to the prayer, the nature of Rebekah's prayer, and the fact that God spoke to her, as in the text, that Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loves Jacob. So just lots of interesting things here for us to ponder from one year to the next as we study the portion. So as our time concludes today, any thoughts or comments before we finish up for today? So folks, I encourage you to keep on reading the Parsha, especially with below the line about other ideas from this week's portion. Wish everybody a good rest of the day. There's Minyan this evening at 7:30. I put out on the listserv other programs and services that are coming up as well. So stay safe and healthy, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Okay, don't fall up there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.